Welcome to my channel Brainies. In today's video, I'm just going to share the information regarding Circle of Willis. So Circle of Willis, the blood supply of the brain, which is very crucial for its function, and it is mainly provided by two main set of arteries. They are the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. These arteries form a complex networks that ensures that the brain receives a constant supply of oxygen-rich blood. So let us just go into the depth of the arteries. The internal carotid arteries, the first and foremost is this artery. So these are the major arteries that supply the anterior part of the brain. Actually, they divide from the common carotid arteries in the neck. The internal carotid arteries enter the skull and split up into furthermore two branches, which is the anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. Anterior cerebral artery, which has been abbreviated as ACA, supplies the frontal lobes and the superior medial parietal lobes. The middle cerebral artery, which has been abbreviated as MCA, it supplies the lateral parts of the frontal, temporal and the parietal lobes. It is the most commonly affected artery in case of hemiplegia, stroke. The next is the external carotid arteries. These primarily supply the blood flow to the face and the neck rather than the brain. The next artery is the vertebral arteries. These arteries originate from the subclavian arteries and extends up to the neck through the transverse process of the cervical vertebra, that is through the foramen transversarium. They enter the skull and merge to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery then divides into posterior cerebral arteries, that is PCA. These arteries supplies the occipital lobe and also the inferior part of the temporal lobe and the various deep brain structures. The vertebral arteries also give rise to important branches like posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which supplies the cerebellum and also the medulla. So here comes the circle of Willis, which is a ring-like structure which is formed by the internal carotid arteries and the branches of the basilar artery. So thus the circle of Willis provides a collateral blood flow between the anterior and the posterior parts of the brain, which is very crucial. Even if one of the arteries gets blocked, so it may entirely collapse the structure. So this is the diagram depicting the circle of Willis. So you could see the vertebral arteries unite together to form the basilar artery, and you have the different branches. Here comes the posterior cerebral artery. This is the middle cerebral artery, and this is the anterior cerebral artery, and this is the artery which is connecting the anterior cerebral artery. Hence we call this artery as anterior communicating artery. Similarly, the one which is connecting the posterior cerebral artery, that artery we call it as posterior communicating artery. And the branches are the posterior inferior cerebellar artery and the anterior inferior cerebellar artery and superior cerebellar artery. The components of the circle of Willis: the internal carotid artery, that is the ICA, the left and right internal carotid arteries. These arteries are the major sources of the blood for the brain. After entering the skull, each ICA splits up into anterior cerebral artery, which supplies the medial and superior parts of the frontal lobes and the superior medial parietal lobes, and the middle cerebral artery. Although it is not a direct part of the circle of Willis, it is the largest branch of the internal carotid artery, and it supplies the lateral portions of the brain, including the parts of the frontal, temporal and the parietal lobes. The next comes the anterior cerebral artery. The right and left ACA arise from the internal carotid artery, and it extends up to the front of the brain. The anterior communicating artery, that is the ACOA, this small artery connects the right and left anterior cerebral artery, as I showed you in the diagram, across the midline. So it completes the anterior part of the circle and allows the blood to flow between these two sides. And the next is the posterior cerebral artery. These arteries originate from the bifurcation of the basilar artery. That is, the basilar artery divides into the two posterior cerebral artery, and it supplies the occipital lobes, the inferior part of the temporal lobes, and the various deep structures which are situated within the brain. Thus, the posterior cerebral arteries contribute to the posterior part of the circle of Willis. The next one is the posterior communicating arteries. These arteries, as I told you about the anterior communicating arteries which connects the anterior cerebral arteries, this posterior communicating arteries connects the posterior cerebral arteries. So it's a communication between the anterior and the posterior circulation of the brain. The basilar artery, which has been formed by the fusion of the left and right vertebral arteries, and it runs along the brainstem. It splits up into the left and right posterior cerebral arteries, which thereby connects to the circle. So that's it with the circle of Willis. Thank you for watching. Kindly support by subscribing and sharing. Meet you all in next video. Thank you once again.